We're going to be talking about the demon of indecision. The demon of indecision. One demon a lot of people will face this year will be that demon of indecision. The demon that does not help you make the decisions you're supposed to make about your life. It is this demon that takes away what God has put in you and the capacity has given you assurance to be able to build. It is this demon that takes away your success from you. In fact, this demon is a success snatcher. So how does it operate? It operates by taking your mind off the things that are beneficial to your life and bringing up the things that are not beneficial to your life. And that's what this demon does. It is this demon that makes you not to make your decisions of how to be able to wake up in the morning and make an impact in the lives of many other people. It is this demon that brings in procrastination and it steals your time. It is this demon that brings in the capacity of thoughtlessness. When people cannot wake up and think about the future and think about prospects and think about possibility and think about what they ought to do to move their lives forward, it is this same demon. It is this demon that arbitrarily steals from people the capacity to make impact and make lasting success. So there is something called a demon. And this demon is a demon that retires people to a place of retrogression. This demon of indecision. The way your life is today is a product of many indecisions or not being able to make decisions of your own accord. And that's what steals your life away. That's what takes capacity out of your life. That's what takes impact out of your life. And once you can't make decisions, there's no how you'll be able to grow. Because decisions are tantamount to growth. There are two types of decisions. Decisions that will make you grow and decisions that will make you fall back. But you see, it's the indecision of making good decisions that determines what happens in your life. And what this demon does, it stays on the way of making good decisions for you. So no matter how you struggle, you will never be able to get around making good decisions. You will never. So what would you do? You will always hover around making decisions that are not, one, in benefit to yourself, two, in benefit to your generation. All your decisions will now become a stumbling block that will hamper the growth and prospect of others. So there's no how. You will not be able to make decisions. Once you fall into the prey of these demons of indecision, then growth becomes far away from you. And when growth becomes far away from you, there's no way you can have admirable progress in life. Because this demon of indecision definitely robs you of everything. So number one, how do you understand for yourself that you're dealing with this demon of indecision? It will bring some signs. What's the number one sign? You will never think progress. Never. It will bring the first sign of comfort zone. That's what it brings. This demon of indecision. The first sign it brings is that of comfort zone. You will be so comfortable wherever you are. That's just it. You'll be so comfortable wherever you are. And when you feel too comfortable wherever you are, it becomes a recipe for disaster. A man must not be too comfortable with wherever he is in life. The moment you start to get too comfortable with wherever you are, it becomes a recipe for disaster. If you are too comfortable with a particular position, it becomes a recipe for disaster. So this is how you know that the demon of indecision is already setting in. When you become too comfortable, you're at a particular level, you say, I'm okay. I don't need to strive. I'm not doing more than myself. No. There's always another level that is better than your current level. There's always another step that is better than your current step. See, even if they are paying you 100 billion, which is not possible in salary where you are, there's always a place called better. You might need to move to a place better to be able to gain more capacity, to be able to gain more insight. But once this demon of indecision sets in, you are always too comfortable wherever you are. And when you are too comfortable wherever you are, it brings in a lot of problems. Me, I have suffered this demon of indecision many times. I get too comfortable, even in places where I have not been treated properly. So we all get there. So the first thing the demon of indecision starts to do to you is you feel, oh, I'm okay here. Not necessarily you are okay. It's because of the demon of indecision, of planning what your next move will be. That's number one. Number two, where you know the demon of indecision is already growing on you, is the fact that you're not growing where you are. You are not growing. You're just there. So when you go and check, what is growth in your life? And what is also development? You see that your life in the last 5-6 years has just become a cyclical pattern. Nothing is moving. You're not learning new skills. You're not learning new languages. You're not learning new insights. Nothing new is being learned. So you are just revolving around that decimal at a point. Indecision is setting in. And once it's setting in, you're not doing new projects. Because the way we are designed as human beings is to be able to stretch ourselves. It is in stretching ourselves we gain insight and impact. You are not supposed to just remain at a particular point. You're supposed to stretch yourself to new possibilities. But when you get to that point where you don't feel like stretching yourself, some of you call it your happy place. Yes, your happy place might be a dangerous place for you. Because you need to stretch. You need to look for. You need to aspire. You need to ask questions. You need to seek growth. You need to seek possibility. So when you're at that point where you don't feel the need to seek growth and possibility again, then it's always a problem. It's always a problem. So you need to start looking and asking, are the demons of indecision battling me? Because you might not be able to make a decision about your life. And you feel truncated. And you just feel stuck at a point. So it's incumbent for you to ask that, are the demons of indecision battling me at that point in time? Because at that point in time, you might most likely be suffering that demon. The point in your life where mediocre standards become your standards. You see, in life, you are not in competition with anybody but yourself. So when you start to use mediocre standards to compete with your life, then you're already suffering the problem of the decision, the demon of indecision. When all about you is very mediocre, very substandard. And that's what heralds your life. Very substandard decision-making process. Mediocre. You see things that you know you can do way better than, but that becomes your standard. For you, you say, everybody is just sitting pretty. Nobody's doing anything new. No, you are not everybody. You are not everybody. And the moment you start to realize in your personal life that you're not everybody, that's going to be the beginning of your transformation. Because some people think they're everybody. Everybody's standard can never be your standard. What everybody believes in should not be what you believe in. You should have your own moral standards. You should have your own moral ethos. So when everybody's standard starts to become your standard, you start to wallow in abject pain and poverty. And that's what happens to you. Then you start to lower your own standards. That's when the demon of indecision sets in. You start to lower your own standards. Things you would normally not take before have now become your norm. Because you don't want to press forward, you don't want to get anything done. So your standards are lowered. And when they are lowered, nothing comes out of them. Everything about your life is a lowered standard. And see, a lowered standard is a lowered life. You should create a particular standard level in your life. But if you do not create that particular standard level and everything starts to operate at a lower standard, then that's the beginning of the end. Because indecision will now hold sway. Indecision will now be order of the day. And what indecision does is, it doesn't give you the capacity for aspiration. You don't aspire, you're stuck in a particular position. Then another thing is when you start to look for company, people that have made their life of lower standard just like yours, you start to look for company of reproach. You now start to sit up with people where their own don't spoil. And you start to talk about the good old days when you ought to make decisions to fix your life. When you ought to make decisions to fix your life. When you start to talk about the good old days, hope you know it's a sign of failure. Because your life now should be better than yesterday. So when you start to crave for the good old days, hope you know it's a sign of failure. You know it's a sign of failure when Nigerians start to talk that life was better then than now. So hope you know it's an indictment on these politicians when Nigeria used to say the good old Nigeria. Because Nigeria today should have been able to learn from its mistakes of yesterday and get better. So for the fact that Nigeria has not learned from the mistakes of yesterday, that we're being nostalgic about the sad days of yesterday, then it's an indication that we are failing. So when you start to say your last year is better than your this year, it's an indication that you're failing at something. And indecision starts to herald your life. So a lot of you, the capacity to be able to make those decisions are things you lack. And a lot of you are so content with where you are. You're not ready to make the decision. You're not ready to do what you need to do. You're not ready to fight the way you need to fight. For you, you're content there. Maybe some of you might have to leave your point of comfort as we speak today. For some of you, your comfort point, what is not making you think, is that 5 spoons of rice that you see to eat freely in that house. That's not what is making you think. That's so comfortable for you, at least at the seafood shop. Some of you, God has put in an empire in you, but you are content with ghetto. You are doing ghetto romance. when all you need to do is to wake up and look for the giftings and express the giftings. So you need to be able to ask yourself the questions of where's the pathway? And the pathway starts from breaking the cycle of indecision. You need to be able to make veritable decisions about your life. Some of you, God has put in so much in you. He's put empires in you. But you are so content about the failures around you and the people that have failed that you found company in. And you can't tell story before. It's people that tell stories before. When I did that place, and you start to tell tales. A man that wakes up in the morning and is telling stories when he ought to be walking is an indication of indecision. Because life is not about telling stories. It's about taking the day. But some people have found misery company. And you see, for every time you need a misery company in life, you always find it. Some people, your marriage is your misery company. You just marry that person because that person can acclimatize to your misery. So if that person is not pushing you to do better or being jealous about the fact that you are doing better, then watch it. So you need to be able to answer these questions. Because you see, the problem is this question is heralding the life of many people. And when you are not making the decisions, you are having a low decision-making quotient, then you're starting to have problems. And these problems will never go away unless you start to make the proper decisions. So the question is, how do you fight to start making the proper decisions? How do you fight to start improving the proper decisions? How do you fight to make decision making your priority? Because you need to make those decisions. I've been able to tell you about the demons of indecision now, but you need to make decisions now. Because these decisions will either make or mar you. So I'm going to give a proper talk on decision making. And I pray it's going to bless you real good. So I thank you all for your time, but you also need to learn the capacity to make decisions, because if you don't make decisions, your life will never go anywhere. Your life will never go anywhere. And that's how people destroy their lives. You will see, 2027, people will make the wrong decisions again. And they will not start crying that anybody, no. You see, my job is just to teach you how to make decisions. Like you make it, like you don't make it, that's your cup of tea. If the nation starts to go bad, we all see it for ourselves. We are all products of the decision we made a couple of years ago. So, that's just it. Like you make the decision, like you don't make the decision. I'll go drink some water and come and see if I can come back and teach on decision making, the things you should look out for when you're making decisions. Bless you. A recipe for disaster. If you are too comfortable with a particular position, it becomes a recipe for disaster. So this is how you know that the demon of indecision is already setting in. When you become too comfortable, you're at a particular level, you say, I'm okay. I don't need to strive. I'm not doing more than myself. No. There's always another level that is better than your current level. There's always another step that is better than your current step. See, even if they are paying you 100 billion, which is not possible in salary where you are, there's always a place called better. You might need to move to a place better to be able to gain more capacity, to be able to gain more insight. But once this demon of indecision sets in, you are always too comfortable wherever you are. And when you are too comfortable wherever you are, it brings in a lot of problems. Me, I have suffered this demon of indecision many times. I get too comfortable, even in places where I have not been treated properly. So we all get there. So the first thing the demon of indecision starts to do to you is you feel, oh, I'm okay here. Not necessarily you are okay. It's because of the demon of indecision, of planning what your next move will be. That's number one. Number two, when you know the demon of indecision is already growing on you, is the fact that you're not growing where you are. You are not growing. You're just there. So when you go and check what is growth in your life and what is also development, you see that your life in the last 5-6 years has just become a cyclical pattern. Nothing is moving. You're not learning new skills. You're not learning new languages. You're not learning new insights. Nothing new is being learned. So you are just revolving around that decimal at a point. Indecision is setting in. And once it's setting in, you're not doing new projects. Because the way we are designed as human beings is to be able to stretch ourselves. It is in stretching ourselves we gain insight and impact. You are not supposed to just remain at a particular point. You're supposed to stretch yourself to new possibilities. But when you get to that point where you don't feel like stretching yourself, some of you call it your happy place. Yes, your happy place might be a dangerous place for you. Because you need to stretch. You need to look for. You need to aspire. You need to ask questions. You need to seek growth. You need to seek possibility. So when you're at that point where you don't feel the need to seek growth and possibility again, then it's always a problem. It's always a problem. So you need to start looking and asking, are the demons of indecision battling me? Because you might not be able to make a decision about your life and you feel truncated and you just feel stuck at a point. So it's incumbent for you to ask that, are the demons of indecision battling me at that point in time? Because at that point in time, you might most likely be suffering that demon. The point in your life where mediocre standards become your standards. You see, in life, you are not in competition with anybody but yourself. So when you start to use mediocre standards to compete with your life, then you're already suffering the problem of the decision, the demon of indecision. When all about you is very mediocre, very substandard. And that's what heralds your life. Very substandard decision-making process. Mediocre. You see things that you know you can do way better than, but that becomes your standard. For you, you say, everybody is just sitting pretty. Nobody's doing anything new. No, you are not everybody. You are not everybody. And the moment you start to realize in your personal life that you're not everybody, that's going to be the beginning of your transformation. Because some people think they're everybody. Everybody's standard can never be your standard. What everybody believes in should not be what you believe in. You should have your own moral standards. You should have your own moral ethos. So when everybody's standard starts to become your standard, you start to wallow in abject pain and poverty. And that's what happens to you. Then you start to lower your own standards. That's when the demon of indecision sets in. You start to lower your own standards. Because you don't want to press forward. You don't want to get anything done. So your standards are lowered. And when they are lowered, nothing comes out of them. Everything about your life is a lowered standard. And see, a lowered standard is a lowered life. You should create a particular standard level in your life. But if you do not create that particular standard level, and everything starts to operate at a lower standard, then that's the beginning of the end. Because indecision will now hold sway. Indecision will now be order of the day. And what indecision does is, it doesn't give you the capacity for aspiration. You don't aspire, you're stuck in a particular position. Then another thing is, when you start to look for company, people that have made their life of lower standard just like yours, you start to look for company of reproach. You now start to sit down with people where their own don't spoil. And you start to talk about the good old days when you ought to make decision to fix your life. When you ought to make decisions to fix your life. When you start to talk about the good old days, hope you know it's a sign of failure. Because your life now should be better than yesterday. So when you start to crave for the good old days, hope you know it's a sign of failure. You know it's a sign of failure when Nigerians start to talk that life was better then than now. So hope you know it's an indictment on these politicians when Nigeria used to say the good old Nigeria. Because Nigeria today should have been able to learn from its mistakes of yesterday and get better. So for the fact that Nigeria has not learned from the mistakes of yesterday, that we are being nostalgic about the sad days of yesterday, then it's an indication that we are failing. So when you start to say your last year is better than your this year, it's an indication that you are failing at something. An indecision starts to herald your life. So a lot of you, the capacity to be able to make those decisions are things you lack. And a lot of you are so content with where you are. You're not ready to make the decision. You're not ready to do what you need to do. You're not ready to fight the way you need to fight. For you, you are content there. Maybe some of you might have to leave your point of comfort as we speak today. For some of you, your comfort point, what is not making you think, is that 5 spoons of rice that you see to eat freely in that house. That's not what is making you think. You're so comfortable. For you, at least at the seafood shop, some of you, God has put in an empire in you, but you are content with ghetto. You are doing ghetto romance, when all you need to do is to wake up and look for the giftings and express the giftings. So you need to be able to ask yourself the questions of where's the pathway? And the pathway starts from breaking the cycle of indecision. You need to be able to make veritable decisions about your life. Some of you, God has put in so much in you. He's put empires in you. For you are so content about the failures around you and the people that have failed that you found company in. And you can't tell story before. It's people that tell stories before. When I did that place, and you start to tell tales. A man that wakes up in the morning and is telling stories when he ought to be working is an indication of indecision. Because life is not about telling stories. It's about taking the day. But some people have found misery company. And you see, for every time you need a misery company in life, you always find it. Some people, your marriage is your misery company. You just marry that person because that person can acclimatize to your misery. So if that person is not pushing you to do better or being jealous about the fact that you are doing better, then watch it. So you need to be able to answer these questions. Because you see, the problem is this question is heralding the life of many people. And when you're not making the decisions, you're having a low decision-making quotient, then you're starting to have problems. And these problems will never go away unless you start to make the proper decisions. So the question is, how do you fight to start making the proper decisions? How do you fight to start improving the proper decisions? How do you fight to make decision making your priority? Because you need to make those decisions. I've been able to tell you about the demons of indecision now, but you need to make decisions now. Because these decisions will either make or mar you. Because I'm going to give a proper talk on decision making. And I pray it's going to bless you real good. So I thank you all for your time. But you also need to learn the capacity to make decisions. Because if you don't make decisions, your life will never go anywhere. Your life will never go anywhere. And that's how people destroy their lives. You will see, 2027, people will make the wrong decisions again. And they will not start crying that anybody, you see, my job is just to teach you how to make decisions. Like you make it, like you don't make it, that's your cup of tea. If the nation starts to go bad, we all see it for ourselves. We are all products of the decision we made a couple of years ago. So, that's just it. Like you make the decision, like you don't make the decision. I'll go drink some water and come and see if I can come back and teach on decision making, the things you should look out for when you're making decision. Bless you.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this event. Let's get the show on the road. Welcome to the LSE for this public event, which is hosted by the Department of Geography and Environment and co-hosted with the Feroz Lajli Institute for Africa. My name is Gareth Jones, and I'm Professor of Urban Geography here at the LSE. And I'm very pleased to be here to welcome you and to welcome Claire Mercer, Deborah James, Sue Parnell, and Ola Aduku to our audience here in the auditorium and online. To introduce very briefly the four speakers, Claire Mercer is human geographer working at the intersection of human geography and African studies. Her early work developed a critique of the NGOization of development, and subsequent work developed post-colonial approaches to civil society and diaspora. She's currently working on new research on peripheral urbanization in African cities. Sue Parnell is Global Challenges Research Professor in the School of Geography at the University of Bristol and Emeritus Professor at the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town. Deborah James is an anthropologist and academic who specialises in South Africa, economic anthropology, political anthropology, and ethnography. Since 2008, she's been Professor of Anthropology here at the LSE. And Ola Aduku is a British African architect who is head of the school at Liverpool School of Architecture. Today we're here to discuss Claire's new book, The Suburban Frontier, Middle-Class Construction in Dar es Salaam. For those of you on X, not me, but formerly Twitter, doesn't matter, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE events. This event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast, subject to the usual technical caveats. Keep your fingers crossed on that one. As usual, there will be a chance for you to put your questions to our speakers, and particularly to Claire. For our online audience, you can submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the top left-hand side of your screen, and questions will be submitted through the monitors to me at the front. Please let us know your name and affiliation, and we're particularly keen to hear from students and alumni, so please let us know if that is you. For those of us here in the theatre, I will let you know when we open the floor for questions. If you can raise your hand in the old school digital way and wait for the microphone, which will rove around and come to you. I will ask you to provide your name and affiliation before posing your question, and I will try to ensure a range of questions from both online and the audience here in the theatre. Following the lecture, we hope you'll join us for drinks outside in the reception. I'm looking hopefully and rather desperately at PSS in the front row. During the reception, copies of Claire's book will be available for purchase. But for now, I'm truly delighted to hand over to Claire Mercer to introduce her book, and then we will pass comment to Sue, to Deborah, and to Ola, each in turn, before Claire has a chance to respond to their comments, and then we'll open up to questions, as I've said. So, without further ado, Claire.
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you all for being here this evening to launch this book. I want to begin with this image. It's the cover of the book. And I want to begin with it because it captures the spectacular and the ordinary nature of what has unfolded on Dar es Salaam's northern periphery over the last 2.5 decades. It's spectacular because the land on which these houses have been built was farmland until the turn of the 21st century. And as recently as the 1990s, Dar es Salaam's northern hinterland was sparsely populated by a patchwork of farms, farmed by indigenous Zaramo who tended cashew and coconut trees, and small farms owned by urbanites who grew fruit and vegetables for local markets. Just 2 decades later, the transformation of this hinterland into low-density, desirable residential neighbourhoods was well underway as urbanites sought affordable land on which to build the house to which they aspired. It's also ordinary, middle-class suburban life that seems to embody a global suburban ideal, close enough to benefit from the city's economy and social life, but far enough from the city to have space outside to grow one's family. But these suburban neighbourhoods are also distinctive in significant ways. And perhaps most importantly, they're being developed through the repetition of thousands of individual cash-based domestic building projects rather than through large-scale financialised property development. This suburban zone is mostly lacking tarmac roads and, as you can see, bulk drainage, sanitation and piped water. These are, in fact, mostly informal settlements, but not as they've been commonly represented in African cities. Most residents may lack formal legal titles to the land they occupy, but that hasn't stopped them from making substantial investments in their suburban property. Over the last 2 decades, people have transformed Dar es Salaam's periphery. And when I first encountered these new residential neighbourhoods in 2012, where I had previously known a rural landscape, they prompted a series of questions for me. Who's building these houses? What kind of urban space is being constructed? And what does this mass auto construction on the city's former peri-urban edge tell us about how African cities and societies are changing? The Suburban Frontier addresses these questions. It examines the transformation of Dar es Salaam's periphery since the late 19th century, from rural hinterland to peri-urban fringe to suburban frontier. And it does so from the vantage point of one neighbourhood, which you can see in the map. It's about 25 kilometres to the north, Sala Sala. And that's where I conducted qualitative and ethnographic fieldwork with house builders and residents on multiple research trips between 2012 and 2022. Starting in the last third of the 19th century, the land farmed by the Zaramo was enclosed, alienated, nationalised, enclosed again and commodified as it was claimed by Arab and European investors, then colonial and post-colonial governments, and then farmers and urban residents. So by the early 2000s, most remaining Zaramo had been dispossessed through hundreds of individual informal market transactions. In their place, a mosaic of the urban poor and the lower middle and upper middle classes had transformed this formerly rural hinterland into a residential suburban frontier. By the mid-2010s, as land prices climbed ever higher, savvy residents were anticipating where the next suburban frontier might develop beyond places like Sala Sala, and they were buying rural land in neighbouring districts, fully expecting that the suburban frontier would come to them in the near future. But there's more to this story than simply a narrative about changing land use on the urban periphery. The central aim of the book is to examine the suburban frontier as the place where Africa's middle classes are being shaped. Drawing on the long tradition of socio-spatial dialectical thinking in human geography, I argue that Dar es Salaam's middle classes are building distinctive suburban landscapes, and that those landscapes in turn shape what middle-classness is. Suburban space is not just an inert backdrop for the ready-made middle classes, nor is it an inevitable step on a linear and universal path of urban development. And thinking with socio-spatial dialectics enables us to see space and society as dynamically co-constituted in a particular time and place. By spatialising our understanding of the dynamics of middle-class formation, I show how investment in property, in which I include land, houses and landscapes, how that's central to middle-class formation and urban futures in Africa. Africa's urban population is projected to triple between 2018 and 2050 to 1.5 billion people, and most of these urban residents will make their lives in these extensive neighbourhoods beyond the central city. In Dar es Salaam, a city that's projected to grow from just over 6 million inhabitants in 2018 to over 10 million by 2030 to become one of Africa's 5 megacities, this process is already underway, as the population residing in peripheral areas is growing faster than it is in central areas. Much of this urban extension is residential in character and peppered with many small businesses, industries and retail outlets, often located in people's homes. This is organic suburbanisation, constructed, extended and improved incrementally as thousands of individual cash-based domestic building projects take shape. It's also highly unequal. The majority of peripheral residents will have to build their own homes, but only a minority will be able to build a comfortable house like the one you saw in the previous photograph. As Africa's urban peripheries are slowly transformed, new ways of being middle class become possible and new forms of socio-spatial inequality are emerging. Understanding how these processes are unfolding on the suburban frontier is vital for thinking about the future of Africa's cities and the spatiality of urban inequality. In the last minutes that I have, I want to briefly outline to you the 3 main arguments of the book. The first contribution of the book is to develop the concept of the suburban frontier as a way of understanding an important dynamic of contemporary urbanisation in Africa. And I use the suburban frontier to conceptualise the urban periphery as a dynamic zone of domestic investment in residential property. The suburban frontier is a zone of commodification, of dispossession, of accumulation, of risk, aspiration and experimentation that is especially productive for middle class formation. The middle classes have been the principal beneficiaries of the commodification of land and the enclosure of plots, accumulating assets in the form of land that can be built on, loaned or sold, and houses that can be lived in or rented out. And this image here on the left is a handmade sign advertising plots for sale in a rural area or on the edge of the city. The suburban frontier is also a zone of aspiration where the middle classes seek to consolidate their social position through the aesthetic value of the architecture and landscapes they're creating. In building desirable residential space that has pushed into the city's rural hinterland, the middle classes have transformed the landscape from these scattered farms and bush into a sea of small-scale self-built houses on individual plots. The relative size, the quality and the lower densities of these buildings, together with the attention paid to architectural design and the use of new building materials, has produced what residents consider to be a desirable suburban landscape when compared with both the congested inner city neighbourhoods and the scattered, poorer quality of the peri-urban fringe that lies beyond the suburban zone. Yet, their property is also at risk here, where the statutory land tenure of the city bleeds into the customary land tenure that prevails in the formerly rural hinterland. Middle-class experience on the suburban frontier is shaped by the twin possibilities for accumulation and loss. Property is always open to contestation from neighbours or strangers, or reclamation by the state under eminent domain, and a great deal of time and money goes into trying to secure property on the suburban frontier. And finally, this is a social and cultural frontier. Here, the new middle classes are pioneering suburban lifestyles around new consumption practices and privatised leisure, transport and social services. By way of the private car, food is purchased in supermarkets, children are schooled in English medium private schools, religious services are attended in newly constructed places of worship, and weddings are celebrated in expensive private hire halls, all without having to enter the city's historic urban core. For the middle classes, life is increasingly lived on the suburban frontier. And what the book does is it takes different aspects of this suburban frontier, with chapters dealing with land, landscapes, houses and lifestyles. The second key contribution of the book is to flesh out an approach to analysing middle class formation in Africa as a process of property accumulation. Amidst the enthusiasm for Africa rising, in 2011 the African Development Bank produced estimates of the size of the middle class in 44 African countries. Tanzania had one of the smallest middle classes on the continent, around 2.9% of the population categorised as middle class, which for the African Development Bank meant a daily per capita expenditure between $4 and $20. And they estimated that just over 12% could be categorised as what they called the middle and floating classes, with a daily per capita expenditure between $2 and $20. But as I show in the book, by the time the African Development Bank had discovered the middle classes in the early 2010s, they were actually already a socio-economic and cultural force in Tanzania, even if they were difficult to pin down. Macroeconomic growth in the 2000s was not accompanied by structural change in the Tanzanian economy. The lack of industrialisation meant that the middle classes has meant that the middle classes are not precisely defined by the relations of production and have historically been more dependent on the state for their economic and social reproduction. Agriculture is the largest sector of employment, and while manufacturing and construction offer higher incomes, but they employ smaller proportions of the population. And foreign direct investment has been skewed towards extractive industries that has not generated large numbers of jobs. So the middle classes are difficult to grasp in this macroeconomic picture, not least because many of them have developed a portfolio of economic activities to maximise opportunities and to minimise risk. And those that I've spoken with as part of this research have included high and low level state employees, salaried workers in international companies and the banking, insurance and legal professions, sales managers, employees of religious institutions and universities, business owners, many of the self-employed and those who've retired from public service. Most people, however, rely on a combination of these different income generating strategies. Moreover, most of them are also homeowners and landowners. And for this reason, I suggest it's worth paying more attention to property in order to understand the position of the middle classes in Africa. Property, understood here as land, houses and landscape, slowly accretes into economic and cultural capital that is passed on within families. This approach to the middle class retains the understanding from Marx that class is a social relation that arises from the social dynamics of unequal ownership of capital and property. It also recognises with Weber and later with Bourdieu that unequal class relations are reproduced through culture. In the book, cultural capital is explored through the aesthetic power of domestic architecture, suburban landscapes and lifestyles. Although, of course, Marx, Weber and Bourdieu were all theorising the dynamics of European societies in historical conditions very different from those that I'm talking about in contemporary Tanzania. And so I've turned to recent anthropological writing that has explored the dynamics of what they've called the global middle classes as a way of thinking about middle class formation beyond the historical experience of Europe and America. And in much of this work, anthropologists have developed what they call a practice approach to class that pays attention to broader political economic structures, but is also concerned with the everyday repetition of actions that form the basis of social classes and the relations between them. So the focus on practices is useful in the context of Tanzania, where the middle classes are unmarked in the vernacular. But as I argue, the lack of a collective noun for middling types doesn't mean that they don't exist in practice. And so social classes are shaped by the things that people do, perhaps unconsciously, in the course of their everyday lives. In the book, what this means is that I pay attention to the dispersed yet repeated practices related to property on the suburban frontier. How people acquire, secure and develop plots of land, how they slowly build a house over time, how they decorate their homes, how they represent the landscape, how they plan for the future, how they spend their leisure time. Land acquisition, landscape formation, house building and lifestyle are distinctive repertoires of property practice through which middle classness emerges on the suburban frontier. The final key argument of the book is to develop the idea of the coloniality of space. And this is a way of thinking about, oh dear, that's the image I want. The coloniality of space is a way of thinking about how the legacies of colonial urban planning linger in the built environment and the visceral experience of the city's landscapes in the past and the present. Colonial urban planning, however patchy and incomplete, enframed African cities, leaving its imprint not only on the city's material form, but also on how people thought about urban space and their place in it. Today, the colonial is not the only logic of the production of urban space, but it remains as the spatial residue of what decolonial scholars identify as the coloniality of power. It endures in colonial land tenure regimes that render the majority of urban residents as squatters without access to decent housing or land rights. It endures in residents' ideas about the aesthetics of good urban space in terms of topography, planning and architecture. And you can see two kind of contrasting landscapes here that are seen on the left-hand side as desirable and on the right-hand side less desirable, too cramped. And in fact, that person was building somewhere further out already at the time I took this image. It endures in colonial land tenure regimes that render the majority of urban residents as squatters without access to decent housing or land rights. It endures in terms of ideas about topography, planning and architecture. And the coloniality of space endures in a hierarchical way of thinking about urban space, in which some places are better than others, and people higher up the social hierarchy deserve to live in better places. As I show in the book, it's also central to middle-class urban imaginaries and urban spatial practices. The most common use of land in African towns and cities is for housing. Yet, the question of how most housing is produced in urban Africa has fallen off most governments and researchers' agendas. In most urban areas, residents fashion their own living spaces in the interstices by building or renting. This is a form of urban space making that is small scale and cash based, yet widely repeated across the continent. And as I show in the book, Dar es Salaam's middle classes acquire, buy, occupy, use, enclose or lend land, and they build, rent, extend and improve domestic space. In so doing, the middle classes make property, raise land values, produce rental opportunities and slowly accumulate material and cultural assets that reproduce middle classness. In the process, they make urban space that works for them.
Okay. Over to you, Sue.
Great. Thanks, Claire. That was really, really useful just to kind of get our teeth directly into it. I wanted to say, though, just to start, there's a reason why you should read the whole book. There is something about the freshness, the wholesomeness, the completeness, the opportunity for nuance and texture in a book volume that you simply do not get in an article. There's a reason we have a book launch and we don't have article launches. And this book is worth reading. It's worth reading, tuck yourself away and read it from cover to cover, because it not only provides us with what you would hope for, which is a narrative arc, you can keep going, the story is clear. It's also helpful that we meet interesting people, we meet interesting places, we come across interesting buildings, we discover things about institutions, but there's a conceptual sophistication that emerges from that narrative. And that's what you generally do not get in individual shorter kinds of articles. And so I'd take it away, put yourself in a corner, get your cup of tea and read it, ideally in the one or two sittings that you can do, because I think there is something to the craft of the production of a book of this kind that is deeply to be celebrated and to be, noted. So absolutely, Claire, thank you for that in that sense. It's the first time I've done trying to read from my notes on a cell phone, and it doesn't work very well. So bear with me while I go on that. I think what for me, just as you get into it, one of the things which is really useful is that the book takes what for us to places which for most people in the room will be places that they do not go to. It does so with sufficient clarity that you are unable to understand the wider points that are being made. And that's really important because it brings to life, we can't all go to all places at all times. And so it's in the consumption of and the reflection of those who are embedded in those places that we're able to think critically, to begin to compare with some of our own realities. So I think that's one of the real values of the book. There's a second value to the book for me in the story that it tells, insofar as I think it validates the experiences of city building in Tanzania, in Africa, for people who live in those places. I think there's a third thing which is really valuable about that, which is that it's documenting, critically, but documenting nonetheless, this rupture that comes out of this wave of urbanization that is sweeping the continent. And if you go back and you think about the city that we're in right now, and you think about the value of books like Outcast London, which take us to the deep, gritty realities of place, at the same time as they reflect on the emergence of a fundamentally new and different kind of society and class structure, as well as a very different kind of physical form. I think that one of the things which I think the book really does well is it offers us, I kept thinking about Hellman's work on Royard and some of the pieces in Johannesburg and how rare those are. How in 100 years' time we look back on the contributions of books like this to say, phew, thank goodness you took the time. Both in the field, because of course this is not a product of a week of engaged research, but rather a sustained process of that, but also in that process of reflection. So I think just to mark that as a significant contribution of the volume. But I wanted to pick up on not the kind of the enduring value of monographs, although I do want to underscore that I think they become less and less a part of academic practice, and we lose the craft of scholarship by letting go of that. And we want to hold it and value it above other kinds of academic production. But I also wanted to try and do something a little bit different from that, and a little different from what you were doing, Claire, which was to summarize what the arguments of the book are. Now, a book that is clear has a crisp argument, and you've heard Claire articulating that. But I think something which is of value also perhaps goes beyond that, a little bit wider than that kind of contribution. And I think for me, what sets this apart is that I think there's the beginnings of a scholarship that is not what we would just call interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, which we also, oh yes, it's very good, nice that it does that. And I think Deborah's an anthropologist, we've got Narkadal as an architect, I'm a geographer. There is an interdisciplinarity to the inquiry which is appropriate when there are new phenomena that we're trying to come to terms with, and when they're complex phenomena that we're trying to come to terms with. And I think that's there and it's present in the book. But I was pleased that I was also able to distill what for me were distinct contributions. In other words, contributions which are narrower, sharper, more specific to particular kinds of communities. In other words, contributions which go beyond the value of Deborah and I talking and recognizing our different disciplines meeting, and where there is some common place in that. And I wanted to highlight for you, the book I think sits at the nexus of geography, which you would expect as a geographer, African studies, but really an area-based tradition that is quite distinct, has a very particular intellectual set of questions, a very particular politics, a small but sharply crafted set of debates, and then urban studies, this much bigger, much more loosely constituted domain of knowledge. And those people don't always talk to each other. There are only a handful of urban geographers who do Africa. There are only a handful of Africanists who do urban in ways that talk about place. Yeah? And so there is value in this nexus and in bringing these communities together. But I thought that for me, what I took also from the book was the idea, the resurrection for geographers and the relocation of what is an otherwise essentially very largely European tradition of writing about landscape. It also brought it into the urban domain. And I think, Claire, that teasing through of kind of people, places, institutions, the insertion of the ambiguities of land ownership, land control, but of the physicality of the earth that leads to and must be controlled in order to be settled, really does build on that geographical tradition of landscape. So it both builds on and challenges that. And I celebrated that as a geographer. Claire knows this, but and some of the rest of you may not, but I like the fact that I don't think of Claire, I'm beginning to think of her as an urban geographer. I think of her as an Africanist. I think of myself as an urbanist who happens to do Africa. But of course there's that coming together, and the real value of the book is to have that detailed, ethically, linguistically, socially, culturally grounded tradition of African studies brought to the study of the city in the African context. And I think particularly north of the Limpopo, that is relatively new. And so a massive contribution in that regard. And then finally, with respect to urban studies, I suppose the thing is the freshest thing, is the thing you were talking about most directly and sharply in your presentation, is this idea of what does the middle class mean? How do we understand the middle class, and what is the relationship to class formation, accumulation, financialization, built form change that we have there? So for me, really, really valuable contributions there. I've got loads of questions there. I know that you've been working on Tanzania for a long time. I know that there are lots of other people working in other places. I found your approach really quite fresh, partly because it was driven by questions presented by the visual and the material encounter with a place. You had to be there to see it, to say, oh my word, what is happening here? And you sort of could read that landscape already because you knew something about it. Could you have done it in another place? Can other people do it? How quickly can you get to that? Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about the transferability of the methodology that is nascent in the book that is there? But yeah, I'm going to hand over to Deborah.
Off we go.
Great, thank you very much. I've enjoyed reading this book a lot, so let me try and give a tiny little taste of that. So I think this book finds its place among a sort of growing literature on the African middle class. And just to sort of spew out a few names, Carola Lenz and Isidore Lobneber, a book called Imagining Futures, Jason Sumich, The Middle Class in Mozambique, Daniel Turt, The Lumumba Generation about the Congo, and then with more of an emphasis on the built environment, like Claire's book, Claudia Gastro. Now, all of these people are generously thanked in introductions. So Claire knows how and where she fits, but she's also made a very novel contribution to this whole field. So it's a fascinating area for discussion and debate. What these books, and particularly Claire's book, brings to the fore is a fascinating contradiction, and that is the fact that this middle class in Africa, quite a rapidly growing thing of not very many generations' existence, has been utterly dependent on the state for bringing it into being. And all these books reiterate this in different ways. And so, in a sense, its emergence became possible, partly because of the colonial state and then because of various forms of accumulation that happened since then. And yet, there's a huge daily struggle involved to actually be middle class. So, on the one hand, it's been sort of structurally facilitated, but on the other hand, there's this extraordinary effort. And you can see this from all the little stories in the book. The book's full of amazing ethnographic vignettes. Starts off with a vignette about a family showing their day and how they get up in the morning and what they do and how long it takes them to get to work from this rather remote place, how long it takes them to get back again. It's an effort. Many of us know this. Many of us also commute in and out of London, but it feels as though somehow there's just less support for people in this position. And that makes the whole thing very poignant, because these people are not just some sort of bureaucratic bourgeoisie, which is a term that you do use, kind of sitting on their laurels and being all complacent. Actually, they really have to work hard to get their whole position in life. And so you don't feel disparaging of them. You know, when you read about them, you don't think, oh, they're just middle class. I mean, really, who's interested in the middle class? They're all the same around the world. So the daily struggle involved is, first of all, getting the land for yourself. Now, it sounds quite selfish. These are lands that used to be communally occupied. Then the socialist government came along and they had all kinds of regime changes and so on. But the people who live there now want security. And it's the most difficult thing in the world to get that security. Claire talks about sort of efforts to try and get documents. And there's a marvelous quote that I just have to quickly read to you. There's a person called, let me find this thing, Rajabu, who comes up several times in the book. Now, Rajabu, by 2018, had not managed to secure formal title deeds for the land that he and his wife had acquired in the 1970s. That's more than 30 years later. After the land had been surveyed and approved by the municipality, the application had stalled at the Ministry of Lands when it emerged that, according to the ministry's maps, Rajabu had constructed his second, larger house directly over the World Bank-built tarmac road that ran through Sala Sala in the resettlement scheme. He lamented, "The maps of the council and the Ministry of Lands show that my property is on the road, which, as you can see, is not the case. But they can't give me a title for a place that is where the road is. So the maps are wrong. They need to redraw them." I just love that little section. I mean, the bureaucracy is there supposedly to enhance and help these people, but actually very, very hard to get yourself where you want to go. The second way in which it's difficult to kind of get your place in this world is this, it's a huge effort to keep and maintain your land. Not only do you have to buy it in the first place where it becomes an asset, but there are certain people who then have to relinquish it. They can't actually afford to keep it up. So there's a second level of effort. Thirdly, simply getting yourself out of suburbia to work and back is a huge effort as well. I mean, the story at the very beginning about them driving 26 miles, taking your children to school somewhere, going to work and so on, and that's a huge effort. And finally, the interesting point to me as well is the amazing effort that goes into throwing extraordinary parties, because there's a lot of consumption that's going on, and a lot of it's quite conspicuous consumption. And again, one would maybe sort of think, oh, these people are just into glitz. They sort of like throwing their money around and having extraordinary cakes to celebrate their graduations from school and so on. But actually, what for me is so interesting is that this kind of respectable behavior, which many of these people are really aiming at and achieving, is basically kind of very, very generous as well. So although there's a tendency towards individualization that Claire is talking about, people maybe used to throw parties in big spaces. Now they're tending to have invitation-only parties in their own living rooms, or maybe in a hall, and you can only come if you've got an invite. They nevertheless involve a lot of generous giving out of food and buffets and amazing celebrations. So there's a huge generosity and a communally implanted element in this thing. So that it's not like your classic bourgeois person who's stuck behind their lace curtains in some suburb in, Middle England somewhere. It's more generous in an interesting way. And that again resonates with much of what I've read about the middle class in Africa. So what I wanted to ask, I know that I'm not going to ask you many questions here, Claire, but I did find it interesting to think about how this kind of respectable behavior, which on one level sounds very, very colonial. It sounds like the colonial, starting off with the Germans, then with the British authorities, kind of implanted certain respectable forms of behavior and said, if you want to belong to the middle class, you've got to get a job in the civil service and then, be a respectable person. In a sense, it seems to derive its importance from those colonial impositions, and yet at the same time, it's very Tanzanian, very African. So for me, this idea of the coloniality, which you talk about quite a bit in your book, seems to be all about an encounter between the local elites and the colonial authorities, not just a sort of imposition of colonial ideas onto some kind of set of people who then somehow just receive it. So I felt like there was a real sense of an emerging space in which people are sort of inculcating themselves with certain ideas, but also changing them into something rather different. I was fascinated by the gendered character of all this, and I found myself wondering, there's all these parties being thrown, people making cakes, people eating cakes. Do the men actually hang out at home, or do they go down the pub? Because there wasn't a huge amount of talk about them. And a lot of the thing in there is about lifestyle, dieting, going to the gym, making and serving and filming the cutting of and then eating the cakes, which, as Claire points out, almost takes the place of killing a beast, which maybe 40 years ago people would have been doing. But again, there is a certain kind of poignancy in all of this, because, as I said, although it seems as if this group of people has been kind of facilitated into being, they have had certain advantages which many other people have not had, those who live in these more sort of squalid-looking houses, which are very much looked down upon by those middle-class types, and yet at the same time, this extraordinary effort that has to be put into just keeping yourself almost going, keeping your head above water, and so on, is just very poignantly portrayed. And so I just wanted to read you one more little story, and that was about Rajabu, who finally ended up with some success. He did actually manage to get his land regularized. So this took a full, I think, about 30, 40 years. In early 2022, while some residents of Salasala were complaining about the cost and bureaucracy of the regularization project, Rajabu had finally managed to collect his title deed. The surveying project had produced an accurate map of the neighborhood, and his house no longer appeared on the road. The new map removed the final obstacle to obtaining his title. The deed for his 3/4-acre plot cost 1.2 million shillings, which is $522. While the promise of secure land titles may appear to take the side of the urban poor, land titling and registration rarely protects the poor against dispossession by the market. So there you get a sense of how, for every person who does make it into that middle class, there's a bunch of people who maybe had to sell their land and somewhere else. They are now living elsewhere, who knows? But in a sense, there's a big dispossession that has taken place at the same time as this consolidation has occurred. I hope I've had it overrun my time.
I was so fascinated, I wasn't clock watching for once. All I do is
Right, I think I might have to, because I'm rather small, I'm going to have to get closer. Anyway, I think reiterating what's being said as well, this is it. This is and you can actually just download it. It's open access. And that's where I'm actually going to start, because I don't care. I think for a lot of Africans, this is important. This is an important thing. The days of, indeed, colonization of, I would say, academic research are slowly trickling down, because we can get the chapters and so on and so forth. And what I do want to do is to congratulate Claire for actually doing a really good, close analysis of Tanzanian society. For those of us who are old enough, we do remember Mwalimu Julius Nyerere and the whole thing about the socialist period. But as we said in the green room, which isn't green, I was really impressed, because I'm British Nigerian, and it's as if Tanzania has rapidly caught up with what's been happening in West Africa, certainly in my lifetime. The first land use decree was in 1973. I can remember, because I was still in secondary school. So the whole idea about doing this close analysis of Dar es Salaam is really important, because it adds to the literature, I think, on cities in Africa. So this is why I maybe slightly digress from Sue. Certainly things have been happening in West Africa for ages, but where I actually would then begin to have a discussion around colonization and decolonization is because the literal coast of East Africa has had a series of people coming through. It's not just the Germans, it goes right back to actually even the Chinese on the island of Zanzibar, and obviously the Sultanate of Oman. So contextually, this is important, because it adds to this literature about what is happening to cities, particularly in this, I would say in this specific case of Dar es Salaam, it's really important because of its long history, the longue durée. So that's your African studies and African histories part. But I've been asked to talk, I guess, as an architect academic, because I don't actually practice, but I do run a school somewhere north of the M25. And I would say that this kind of information is very important, the research that's being done. And although it's in geography, there are certain chapters which certainly, let's say, speak to the architectural condition, which again, we rarely ever get. So it's really good to have this discussion, which actually does contextualize the idea about the Swahili house and how that has happened, how over time this has transformed, particularly as, I guess, urbanization and urban formation has happened in Dar es Salaam. So we know that the bigger cities in the coming, 50 years are, wherever, the Lagos nexus, Congo, Brazzaville, and so on, but certainly the speed of both urbanization and population has meant that, as Claire has pointed out, the population of Dar es Salaam is quintupling over time. So this is very important. I think the issue about where urban space goes and the frontiers is another interesting one. I would say the middle classes have always been contested, even here. I mean, if we substituted what's going on in Sala Sala with some of the wimpy homes that I find on the periphery of the various cities I live in, you're getting the same kind of things. The idea that because it's not architected by an architect, it isn't home, is something, again, that I would say is quite general to what we consider aspirational. But I guess the question is, what is class? Because I think there's a grey area. I mean, as you point out, there are those who are in that category, whatever the African Development Bank says about, is it $2 to $40? But then there's also this in-between living, which we would find in Latin America, and I'm sure we'd find in Southeast Asia as well. But the specifics of the African case are very interesting, and this is where I would agree that it's really an African studies, African geography discussion. In another research project I'm involved in Manchester, the African Cities Research Consortium, we've been looking at 10 cities across sub-Saharan Africa, and the issues that are coming up in Dar es Salaam are similar. There are issues about space, there are issues about where people are able to find shelter. And if we think about shelter as being one of those sustainable development goals, everybody needs a roof over their head. How do you do that? And what becomes the city, what becomes the grey area, the periphery, becomes really important. So that's the kind of identity thing. I would think I'd then want to talk about the materials and materiality of the space. And this is where, again, the concrete block formation, this could be Lagos, I'm sure it could be actually some parts of Cape Town, maybe not Kailicha. But the idea about what is home is, I guess, an aspiration for many. So if I put on my sustainability hat, the question is, again, the cement block. I know those networks because that's part of the research we're doing. We're sort of saying the richest man in Nigeria who's just built a refinery for us, his main material was cement. And apparently the trucks go right across war zones to get to places like East Africa and Central Africa. I was in Malawi a year ago, and they were talking about cement coming from Nigeria. Geographically, I couldn't quite get my head around it. So these materials that are being used are international. And there are these issues about how these flows work, and indeed who's paying and how much is it costing, particularly now that we're in another set of economic spirals. When we talk about what the urban future of Africa is going to be, there's that question about what we're using. So one of my questions was, did she see solar collectors on anybody's roof? Because in West Africa, it's become a thing. But I was sort of saying, in a longer term geographical discussion, not everybody with an aerial on their roof has a TV. So, what are the things that make you middle class? Is that one of the things? Where are we looking at the future? But I think, aside from that, these identity questions and materials, I think there's that issue about where things are going in terms of how we understand space and how we understand the architecture of space. Because this is where I like being historical. I mean, there's an issue about whether indeed in a lot of Africa we need to be in these houses. And indeed, in one of the quotes, one of your respondents says, if I was to build it again, I wouldn't build it this big. So there's something about, I want to show that I've arrived. Which again is not unusual. This is something that I guess this is where I contradict myself. That is possibly aspirational middle class ambitions and so on. What do we do? Where do we do it? And how do we show it? And I think Claire is absolutely right. Your house, well, like here, everybody's house is their kingdom. But in a future world, where are we going to go with this? And this idea about this sprawl that continues, so it's north of Dar es Salaam to Bagamoyo, or rather people commute, which again a lot of us do anyway. Even here I stare into the abyss sometimes when I'm trying to get from outer Manchester into Liverpool or Manchester or whatever it is. But the whole idea about the infrastructure, the networks around how which we support ourselves becomes really, really important. I think the other question I would ask, though, is, I guess it's around, indeed, the generosity, but is it some... Let me rephrase it. I have written or collated two, volumes on gated communities. I was actually quite surprised about how individualistic it seemed a lot of the formation was in Dar es Salaam. In certainly Lagos and probably bits of Accra, the street would gather together. And I'm not saying that the street would necessarily be planned, but a series of people would gather together and wall out their buildings. Then they would employ what we would call a MIGAD, so that's a security person to look after. And then they would also contribute to a borehole and so on. So there's that kind of communal thing. But I wonder whether that's back to do with the insecurity of land tenure. So going back to even Nigeria with its 1001 things, land tenure, I guess, sounds like it's more secure than here, where you're sort of saying that even with the certificate and so on, at any time, people who feel they've got tenure to land could be moved off. But I think, to me, that was the thing that seems somewhat different in terms of comparators. But I think certainly it gave a very unique and I think well-needed analysis of what's happening in Dar es Salaam, particularly post-socialism, now it's post-Magufuli. Where is it going next? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ola, Deborah, and Sue. I'm going to give Claire a few moments to gather her thoughts and then respond. While she's doing so, if you haven't already, please start composing your thoughts and questions to come after that, if you would, please. So, but before then, Claire, the panel has already posed some questions, I guess, and some points to raise, so it's response time.
Should we maybe collect some questions?
Oh, do you want to cut straight into questions?
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, of course. Microphones to the feet. There's a question here in the front. The race is on, and the winner is, if you'd say who you are and affiliation, if you want to give it away, and your question.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much.
Not
Claire.
working yet.
It is.
Yep.
It is.
Hi,
Good.
good evening. Thank you very much, Claire and everyone. My name is Jonas Lethierry. I'm a PhD candidate at DPU at UCL. I have two questions. The first one, Magufuli, was mentioned briefly at the end. I'm curious, because you said you did 10 years of field work. I'm curious whether the different political climates in Tanzania in the last 10 years shaped the practices that you observed in your research. The second question is a bit broader. I was wondering if in the property practices and landscapes that you witnessed, whether any of your research was focused on the relations to the natural environment. What are the relations of the middle class to the natural environment, and how are their decisions in terms of property defining their long-term relations to the natural environment as Dar es Salaam urbanizes?
Thank you. I'm going to open the bidding on any more questions. There's a question at the back.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Hi, I'm Zoma Pogata. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and Environment at the LSE. So really excited, Claire, to read this book. But I just have two questions. The first one, and I'm speaking as a South African with a very particular understanding of the black middle class experience in South Africa, is I'm quite curious about the relationship between middle class formation in Tanzania and debt. because that is a relationship that's very intricate in the South African context, especially for Black South Africans, Black middle-class South Africans. And then my second question, it's quite a cheeky question, but what's next? Following, your celebrating and relishing in the success of this chapter in this research project. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, and directly in front of you to Jenny.
Yeah, Jenny Robinson, Geography, UCL. So Claire, can't wait to read the book. Just looking at that landscape, I'm thinking, does it talk to me about class, or does it talk to me about networks, political access, corruption, who gets hold of the land? So just wondering about what stories it can tell. And are they necessarily rich people or middle-class people, families maybe gathering together? I was also struck by your picture of the maize field with a little pondoki hut in the middle of it. This doesn't necessarily mean it's a poor person. It could be the richest person owning many such properties, protecting them from occupation. So, which also brings in then questions of developers, larger scale efforts, which I think Ola was alluding to in Nigeria and Ghana, where bits of land are taken over by developers, and these kinds of estates are brought forward in a more systematic and quite exploitative way. So the power relations of leveraging land from the poor are even more extreme than you described. So just wondering about what the landscape says. And then on the other side of that is, I came in just when you're talking about the efforts people have to make to survive, to get into town, to get to the shopping center. This is really a problem for the future. These are terrible landscapes, dispersing everyone's activities, making them car dependent in still monocentric cities. Where does the waste go? People are burning things. I mean, really, they're terrible landscapes for the future sustainability of cities in Africa. So I just wondered what your thoughts are about that, what to do about them, and how to make maybe better kinds of landscapes come out. How do you imagine people could organize to make a different outcome from the social relationships that are producing these places? So that's more of a policy wonk kind of question. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a portfolio enough to start unpacking. Over to you.
Yeah. Okay.
No need to thank me.
Thank you, Sue, Deborah, and Ola for those really wonderful reflections. It's so fascinating to hear what each of you read in the book. Sue, you asked how transferable is the kind of methodology? Could people do it in another place? And you were kind of talking about the craft of geographical scholarship, and I think that many of us are already doing it in other places. I think that increasingly geographers are kind of going back to the monographic form, and geographers are writing about cities, and not just through concepts about the city. Geographers are bringing, as the questions from the audience are already telling us, geographers are thinking about the relationship with landscape, with society, with nature, with policy questions. I mean, I think that, obviously I'm not the first person, and you weren't saying this, but I'm not the first person to have engaged with place, but I think that geographers are increasingly doing it, and I think doing it beautifully. There's a lot that we can actually learn from this kind of collective scholarship of writing about place, as kind of geography wants us to do, trains us to do. I'm just trying to read. I've picked up one pen that doesn't work very well, so I've been desperately trying to scribble. And then, it's a bit late now. Unless you want to say it all again. So, Deborah, I really like the way you pulled out the contradiction between the ways in which people are dependent on the state, and yet there's this kind of huge daily struggle, and that was definitely something I wanted to capture. The other kind of contradiction for me that's at the centre of the book is the fact that these landscapes are are constructed, and they're partly aesthetically pleasing because they are relatively beautiful to the people who make them, and they're desirable, and yet that makes many more people want to come, and it kind of ruins the landscape. And so what's kind of fascinating to me is that kind of contradiction, like the middle classes are in a way that are kind of victims of their own success. And so at the end of the book, the conclusion starts with when I go out to visit somebody who's building on the kind of next frontier and how difficult it is to get out there. You know, you had to take a bus, and you had to change to a three-wheeled tricycle, and then I had to get on the back of a motorcycle to go to where one of the people who had built in Salasala and who was now building 10 kilometres out. And that contradiction between, you know, the building of the desirable suburban frontier that also eventually undermines it, that drives a lot of the kind of class anxiety. You know, given this contradiction, how are we going to maintain our middle classness and our distance from the poor? And it is something that people were thinking about and talking about, and many people that I met had already bought land further out, and they had this plan to build elsewhere in the future, which kind of comes to Jenny's point about, and a number of you have raised, what's the future? It is extension. That is the future. So I'm just trying to go through and find your comment. Oh, your comment about respectable behaviour. It is partly what is respectable is about formal education, some kind of active income generation. It's kind of clear where income comes from. That's seen as respectable. Family life, observing religious practice, but what it means to be middle class and what it means to be respectable in Tanzania is also overlain with socialist ideals. And what's kind of fascinating is that this is a kind of ongoing debate, I think, the kind of socialist legacy and what that means for ideas about respectability and modernity and what kind of futures people aspire towards. So, and you see that in houses where those who build too fast or whose sources of income are not clear are questioned. Maybe not directly, but you know, people will raise eyebrows if someone's built really fast because it's not clear where the money has come from, and there is an anxiety about how wealth is generated and who's benefiting and what are some of the shady deals that might have gone on or not. And so the kind of questions about respectability in a post-socialist context are kind of there to be read in the landscape, in these houses and what people say about them and the practice of their building. Do the men hang out at home or go down the pub? Well, they do both. One of my favourite kind of ethnographic moments was being in Salasala one Saturday morning and walking on the main road trying to find people to talk to, and we saw in the distance a kind of open air bar, and it was like, I don't know, 10 o'clock in the morning. So it's kind of open air and there's a kind of concrete slab. And I realised that there were about 10 men who were doing a step aerobics class. And you could see them from the main road. And I was kind of so fascinated by this. I mean, I'm talking about like 10 years ago. So now there are kind of running clubs everywhere. But 10 years ago, this was still, you know, still quite something to be seen. It wasn't something that you saw very often. So I went to try and talk to them and kind of had to wait for them to finish their step aerobics class. And then when they'd finished it, they kind of brought the chairs back onto the concrete plinth and ordered beers and meat soup and sodas and the kind of male kind of bonding activity around drinking began, and they were planning what they would be doing for the rest of the day. But men were also absolutely central to the rituals at home, and the new kind of lifestyle practices that I talk about. So, for example, I talk in the book about going to a primary school graduation where the kids who leave the primary school, there's a whole kind of event at the school to celebrate the kids going on to secondary school. And so that's a kind of new kind of event, but then after that event people would go to their homes and the family would be together where they would continue the celebrations. So men and women were both hanging out in the home and going to various rotating credit groups, religious groups, community groups, and step aerobics classes. I can't read what I've tried to scribble. That's not good, is it?
Here's a photo of the graduation cake.
Oh,
She's
yeah.
got a graduation hat on it.
Mortarboard.
Yeah, mortarboard, that's it, yeah.
Ola, your question, your kind of comment about materials. I mean, and it kind of goes to Zoe's question about what's next. So the research I'm doing now, kind of post-book, is looking with colleagues at the University of Manchester and in Dar es Salaam and in Accra, looking at the kind of economies around house building, and part of that work is really interested in these new building materials. So when I first started doing this work in 2012, the kind of new roofing sheets that were available were, people would say they were described as South, because people thought they came from South Africa. Yeah. And some of them did. But just in like 12 years, the kind of the different types of roofing sheets that are available on the market and where they come from and their quality and their colour and their pattern and what they're made of has kind of really exploded. And so I think your question about materials and the kind of, the geographer in me wants to kind of understand these geographical value chains and how they're produced and where they're coming from and what that means, because I do think it's a really important question. Are there any solar panels on roofs? I have encountered one solar panel. It wasn't on a roof, it was in a garden, but not massively yet, although people are more interested in rainwater harvesting. Okay. I would say that's much more common. But the question about, and it comes to your question as well, about nature and the environment, I mean, it's just, all I can say is that people didn't talk about it. People didn't appear to be considering it in their building practices. But I also didn't therefore then go and kind of ask people. It's quite possible that things are happening. Well, of course, it's very possible that things are happening that I didn't pick up on. But I didn't. People explicitly didn't talk about it. People did worry about the environment, but more kind of as it affected them. So, for example, in a house very much like this one, there's a kind of path that ran up the side of it, and it was kind of on a slope. And during the rains, massive gullies would form because this is kind of sandy soil, and so it was impassable in the rains. And so what a group of neighbours did was that they came together and they entered into an agreement with a waste disposal company who would collect waste from around the city and then take it to the dump. And they came and they dumped it in the gully in the street until it was full, and then they compacted it with sand. And that was the kind of solution, and this happened in a number of places that I saw. So people were struggling with the environment, but mostly as indeed here, mostly just trying to kind of patch it up and continue their lives, not to kind of rethink what they were doing. So, you know, when the paths flood, it's about, well, how do we, you know, mend this road so that we can continue to use our cars. So I didn't come across conversations and anxieties about the environment, but yeah, so it's kind of difficult to answer that question. I've forgotten what Jenny asked.
Should we see if we can collate some more questions, Claire?
Yeah, while I'm just.
Available.
Can I go to Jenny's question about what stories do landscapes tell? It's such a great question. What does the landscape tell us? And as you know, I'm not a geographer of landscape, so.
I think you are.
But that was the question that because I mean my entry into this research project wasn't me sitting here in the LSE and thinking, right, I'm going to go and find the middle class, or I'm going to go and try and understand house building. I actually kind of stumbled across these landscapes, starting to try and do some research about rural to urban migration, and then when I ended up kind of tracing rural migrants to Dar es Salaam and going to many of these houses in and around Sala Sala, that's when I was like, actually, no, this isn't a story about rural to urban migration. This is the story here, this landscape. So it was the landscape that was what I wanted to understand better. And yes, I mean, some homes and parcels of land were connected to local politicians or national politicians. A lot of stories about people building ostentatious buildings, and well, he works at the Tanzania Revenue Authority, so you know that must be why he's been able to put up this very large house. But for the most part, you know, grand corruption or kind of stories about misdeeds and misdoings were very few and far between. And you know, most people whom I met and talked to, you know, just ordinary people who were, you know, trying to access land, engaged in kind of long disputes with neighbours over a boundary, or somebody who's built too close to a wall and, you know, the rain is coming off their fence over into my back garden, you know, mundane, everyday politics with a small p, rather than kind of, you know, more larger stories about kind of corrupt practices or how people have accessed land. And that was my experience from spending time walking around and talking to people who'd built in these areas, which is not to say, of course, that these politics play a role in these landscapes, but I think that these landscapes are, to use your term, they're more ordinary, you know, than we might otherwise assume. And developers, there are, as you know, there are some in Dar es Salaam, many, far fewer than in other African cities. But again, what's driving this kind of sprawl and this building, it's not even relatively medium-scale domestic developers. You know, talking generally, it's individual families, individuals who are trying to access land and to build. And I think that's kind of what both surprised me and what I found fascinating and what I wanted to document in the book, I think. Yeah.
Thanks. I think we've probably just got a minute or two for one more round of questions. If you can get the microphone in here. And then take over to Fuya, and then one further back again. That's probably. Oh, and Ben. Okay. Well, we'll collate the questions and then maybe
answer really quickly.
Answer discerningly.
Hello, I'm Digby Hunt. I went to Forest School in Walthamstow, and I'm wondering if the Tanzanian government is sort of thinking of any funding for like state building housing projects to support the emerging middle class and ensure like safe and sustainable housing for the longer term.
Thanks.
Puya Godusi, LSE Fellow. Looking forward to reading the book, but looking back at your older research and where you started this, ending up on landscape, but you were interested in movement of people, on transnational links, hometown associations. I want to know if we go back and use that lens again, if you want to look at what you have seen. Do you see a movement of people from the center of the city towards the suburbs, the other way around? What about transnational links? What about the movements of people? Thank you.
Hi, Professor. My name is Samir. I am a student at the LSE, and I am from Tanzania. I live in Dar es Salaam and split my time in Iringa. My question is specifically on the role of government with the growth of these housing developments outside of Dar es Salaam and outside of cities as a whole. What role does government play in limiting that growth? Because it is a little uncontrolled, especially as you mentioned, that housing enabling infrastructure doesn't exist. Plumbing isn't there, electricity isn't there. So what role does government have to play to either continue to permit or to limit uncontrolled growth?
Hi there. Is that working? Yeah. Hi, Ben Page from UCL. Congratulations on the book. It's wonderful to see it in print. My question is prompted by some of Ola's remarks and reflex to kind of compare what's happening here in the UK with what's happening in Dar es Salaam and that move. And I was kind of thinking, of course, it's not the case anymore that the middle class can assume that their children will own a house. And there's significant proportion of this population that will never own a house. And I wondered if that was kind of an anxiety of the middle class in Dar es Salaam at all. What's going to happen to their kids? If there's any talk of inheritance or dividing properties, or what's that future going to look like? What's the generational story?
And Claire, hold on. There is an online world which I've been alerted to and reminded of, so Catherine.
We have a question from Belinda Dodson, and she says, can you say more about the diaspora element in making the suburban frontier, financially, aesthetically, and socially/culturally?
Okay, right.
Say some more, but not too much.
Yeah, okay. So the question about state building housing for the longer term, and also the question about the role of government. So the Tanzanian government has never provided enough housing for its citizens, which is why people build their own houses. And housing policy is very low down the government's list of priorities. And yet, many of the people who are building the houses that you see here work for government. And so when we say, what is the government doing? The government isn't doing anything, but people in the government are part of what is driving this middle class and this suburban frontier. So I think we have to kind of recognise that kind of duality when we talk about the government. The question about migration and movement and diaspora, and yes, to answer your question, Puya, people are moving outwards from the city centre out to the suburbs and further on again after that. But Belinda's question about the role of the diaspora, I haven't found a great deal of evidence of the diaspora in house building and the kind of cultures and practices around house building in Dar es Salaam. and I think that's very different from West Africa. I mean, I'm thinking of Ben's work in Cameroon, where the diaspora are absolutely central to that dynamic, and I think that's partly because just to compare Tanzania and Cameroon, the Cameroonian diaspora is much larger and internationally mobile compared to the Tanzanian one. But the question, Ben, that you asked about the middle class anxieties around children and inheritance and the future, that's partly, I think, what's driving the acquisition of land and plots. It's not just about building a house, but actually people will have a portfolio of plots, and some which they intend to build on, some which they intend just to give to their children for their inheritance. So the middle classes are definitely thinking about this, and it is something that is anxiety-inducing for them, and it's definitely part of their strategy for how they accumulate land. Inheritance is one of the key things, because these houses aren't being sold. There isn't really a housing market. People are building, and often it's the land that the houses are on that's more valuable than the house itself, and it's keeping hold of that land rather than trading houses in a market that's what's really valuable for people.
Okay, thank you very much. We don't have cake, I don't believe, at least in any shape or form outside, but we do have that most suburban and middle class thing of all, which is wine and nibbles. So we can all aspire and show off our aesthetic values in that form. But before we do that, I want to thank Ola, Deborah and Sue for their generous comments.